Hi, my name's Joe Cernik. I'm a member of the faculty here at Lindenwood University, and I'd like to welcome you to Insight. Now, Insight is the show where we normally discuss books on politics, both domestically and internationally, sometimes historical books that provide some insight into the present, sometimes broader atmospheric or trend analysis developments to take a look at actual political developments. Today's book is written by a man named Alan Dershowitz, who is a very well-known professor at Harvard Law School. The title of his book is called Trumped Up: How Criminalization of Political Differences Endangers Democracy. Now, joining me on the show today are three Lindenwood University students. To my immediate right is Johnny Peddicord. To Johnny's right is Madison Liddle. And to Madison's right is Curtis Hecler. Now, I want to read an opening quote and then use that as a way of jumping into a discussion about the book. The author writes, "The special counsel's broad investigation raises some dangerous implications for civil liberties. But the Trump administration has also endangered civil liberties. Trump has tried to weaken constitutional protection accorded political speech. Trump vowed to change libel laws to make it easier to sue his critics. But any change could boomerang against Trump himself, who uses ad hominem attacks as a political weapon. We are at a point where tens of millions of Trump opponents cannot communicate with tens of millions of his supporters. There is no viable vocabulary. There is no shared reality."
Sure, I agree with that. I think one of the biggest points of the book is that centrism doesn't sell. It's not sexy, it's not flashy. I think we're at a point politically where people have to either be on one side or the other. It's black and white, it's absolutes. And I think that kind of kills political discourse in the country, at least progressive political discourse in this country, for sure.
I would agree. He makes a point in the book at the beginning where he talks about how the left is becoming more intolerant and the right is becoming more authoritarian, and how that divide has caused people to either pick the middle ground no longer exists. You're either forced to choose between one or the other, and the middle ground is you can't find there anymore.
I think I would tend to disagree a little bit to a certain extent. I mean, first of all, when Trump did run for president, he wasn't necessarily the most conservative of the bunch. So he's kind of been wanting to tighten up security and put a check on crime and other aspects of the law since day one of his campaign. However, I don't think it is quite as dramatic as it is made out to be. I mean, you just look at Trump's tweets. You know, he tweets on a regular basis. Some things he says are, can be best described as outlandish. But at the same time, it's not necessarily going to be something that implements policy.
Yeah, I think one of the problems with Trump, I sort of agree, is he says so many stupid things in these tweets that as a result you sort of don't have time to sit down and take a look at, well, what is he proposing or what are the Republicans proposing? So it's sort of like a child. He's actually almost like an idiot child at times, and rather than just say, well, if you stop it, people can sort of say, okay, let's actually have a conversation about, past tax reform. What does it look like? What is some of your policies going to do? I'm trying to go through his budget proposals now, but then it's sort of like I always have to make sure, oh, darn, I got to read another article on tweeting. And so then it's sort of, and I've had to sort of teach myself to ignore the articles on tweets so I have more time to take a look at what policy analysis is. And I guess that's one of those complaints I got of TV news. They spend too much time on, rather than saying, okay, we're not going to talk about the tweets today. We figure you know what he did. Now let's spend time on something more substantive that may have an impact on people.
Sure, and I think the media has a hard time with that too. Not just the TV media, but I think the print media. I think in Thanksgiving, one of the headlines that I'd read, I don't remember what publication it was. I think Washington Post had how Trump ruined Thanksgiving this year. Who cares? Like, nothing substantive. You're right. Nothing substantive is being discussed. And I think anytime something substantive is being discussed, it's usually in the form of a criminal accusation, especially from the media. And I don't want to say he's being attacked by the media, but it feels like, at least for unless you're Fox News or Wall Street Journal, nothing that he does could ever be right. Whether it's whether it's right or not.
More the Wall Street Journal editorial board.
Sure, yeah.
As opposed to the,
And that's largely discussed in the book, is how, you know, criminalization is being accused when it's just difference in preference a lot of the times.
I also think kind of at the same time, the author, based on his opening statement, he kind of seems to jump to conclusions on the extremes that exist in our both in our political world and also in the media in of itself. You know, we've discussed in times past about, you know, liberal-ish versus conservative-ish. It's not exactly sort of a red versus blue thing going on here. There's multiple shades of color in this political spectrum here.
Sure, but those extremes are also the vocal majority.
Exactly.
That's what we hear. That's what we see every day in the media. We don't see the quiet centrists. We don't see the center left or the center right coming out and speaking for moderation. We want to see the flashy. We want to see the Sean Hannitys and the Rachel Maddows. We don't want to see the guy in the middle who makes a reasonable, substantive discussion.
That seems to be pretty normal.
Sure.
I remember a quote from a congressman from North Carolina, and he was at his town meeting, and this was when Obama was president. We just passed health care reform, and on television all you saw was the screaming and the hollering and the screaming and the hollering, and no camera showed up, and he said, you know, it's because we were sitting there and having a normal conversation and nobody in the room was screaming and hollering, and so as a result we didn't make the news.
Sure.
And so then you had that, and I saw that on C-SPAN. I would turn on C-SPAN, and I saw some very coherent questions being asked. I didn't see a lot of people sort of losing their nutsies upstairs and sort of going crazy. And I'm thinking, I don't see this on Fox or MSNBC. What I'm seeing here is coherency.
Right. I think the media perpetuates a lot of that, and they take the extremists because they, like you said, they are flashy, they are sexy, and they do create that desire, and they're marketable more than anything else.
He made this statement. He says, among the problems with a special counsel, so this is Robert Mueller, as distinguished from a more usual prosecutor, is the mandate of the special counsel is far more specific. He is given either a subject or a person to investigate. In this case, the subject is, roughly speaking, Russian connection. Okay. But then down here, he's quoting, and he says, so Mueller has the authority, and he says, quote, investigate any links or coordination between the Russian government and individuals associated with the campaign of Donald Trump. That sounds specific. But then he says, and any matters which arose or may arise directly from the investigation, which sounds like that goes off anywhere. So, so at the one time I can understand what he's saying regarding a special counsel, and yet it sounds specific, but it doesn't.
Well, I think that they're trying to keep it vague because at the heart of the special counsel, it's nothing more than a fishing expedition. There's been no concrete laws broken. There's been no circumstantial evidence presented. It's for the most part hearsay, and I think that what they're doing is just dredging the lake, trying to see what they can come up with. And to me, it reeks of McCarthyism. Where anytime someone disagrees with someone on that side of the aisle, then we're going to stick the special counsel on you. And I think that that's what we're seeing here. And it's the same thing that we saw on the right with Hillary Clinton, with her email scandal or what have you. I think it's just I think it's weaponizing justice is exactly the way I would term it.
He's, and bringing up things such as the idea of, okay, so you're having a lot of people that are screaming and hollering that they don't like Trump, but then he's also referring back to, well, there was when Obama's giving his State of the Union, you're having some idiot congressman yelling, you lied, in the audience. And so as a result, the idea of making it look like, well, we're going to ignore everything that happened before, but we're going to talk only about right now. Not the last didn't count, but now does. And so I think he does sort of a decent job of that through the book.
Sure.
And then it's an interesting book in the sense that I thought his approach to the FBI was interesting.
Yeah, it was. I personally think, and I tend to agree with Mr. Dershowitz, that James Comey overstepped his bounds. In that, I don't believe that it's the director of the FBI's job or his duty or his prerogative even to say or to recommend prosecution. I thought that was always the Attorney General's job. And the job of the FBI was to gather and present evidence and no more, no less. But I think that the paradigm kind of shifted when Comey decided to interject himself or interject the recommendations of the FBI into that investigation. I think that kind of caused everything to fall apart.
The way he approached it, and I thought that was rather interesting. So here was Comey, when he was director of the FBI, announcing, well, we're investigating these emails. In other words, the one he announced just a few days before the election. And this is when the Clinton campaign really went nuts. And so immediately, it was the way he said it. We're investigating emails that might have security clearance on someone else's computer. And then what he says is the way it was stated was all wrong, because it implied that they already knew that these were security clearance, as opposed to what you find out later is he should have said something like, well, we don't know what we're looking at. We have no clue. We don't think it's this. We don't think it's that, because I've never seen anything, so I don't know what I'm talking about. And more or less that's what he's saying should have been said, as opposed to the way Comey said it. And so it's interesting. He's very critical of the FBI, or rather specifically Comey as FBI director at that moment, but the way he approaches it.
Exactly. I think the investigation in of itself was not necessarily politically motivated. Sure. However, it was definitely the timing of discussing the investigation and trying to bring all the processes together to continue the investigation and go ahead and prosecute Hillary Clinton. Just several days right before the election, that's clearly going to be political dynamite right there.
Sure. He definitely created that presumed guilt. The way he worded it, he created that guilt when there really was no foundation for that at that point, and still to this day there really hasn't been any basis to prove that what he said was accurate.
Right. Sure. Yeah, and what Dershowitz was saying is, well, wait a minute, what we now know is he didn't know anything,
right.
But it was the way he said it. Why did he even say it? Why did he have to at that point? And I thought he presented it in a more, I'd call it, balanced way.
Sure, sure.
You know?
Yeah,
and certainly the way he presented it did help Donald Trump. You know, that it created sort of an impression that there was something there.
It did. And I think the whole investigation, the timing, I agree with Curtis that the timing of it was just absolutely egregious. But I also think, too, that Hillary Clinton's husband, Bill, former President Bill Clinton, kind of stepped on his foot by getting on a plane with the Attorney General a few days before the decision was made whether or not to prosecute, or before the announcement was made whether or not to prosecute. And I think that whether it was innocuous or not, I think that decision to have that in plain view was kind of is not good for optics, I guess is what they call it these days.
Now, he spent a little time on the Democrats. He doesn't like Bernie Sanders, and even though now the election is over with, he's concerned that Sanders will become sort of too prominent within the Democratic Party, even though he's an independent.
Sure.
So that there's some discussion about sort of the fighting that goes on within the Democratic Party. Do they remain more sort of center-ish, or do they move to the left? And left is sort of, well, these terms get to be subjective,
right.
But more or less I think he's worried first about some image, and then he's worried about if they look like they come across to being hostile to Israel. So when he's looking at this, he sort of supported Hillary Clinton, but he supported her because he saw her as being center, which
Right.
I thought was interesting.
Yeah, I didn't really think about it like that, and he kind of opened my eyes to Hillary Clinton's platforms and kind of drew that connection to her being center-left, a center-left pragmatist, as opposed to Bernie Sanders being a far-left idealist. And I do agree in the extent that, yeah, he did hire some we'll call it anti-Israel as opposed to anti-Semitic aides to his counsel, and I think that kind of influenced, and the things that he was spouting on the news about the 10,000 casualties, which was inherently false, just kind of shows that Bernie Sanders, and then his domestic policies, his financial policies are not feasible, and that's been proven by economists all over the place. I think his worry that Sanders is going to make some kind of a prominent stand in the next few years, I kind of doubt that, because as we're seeing now, Bernie Sanders is kind of, after the DNC kind of smashed his campaign, I think he's just kind of sitting down and finishing out his ride.
Yeah, the one thing you said, Clinton wants realistic improvements in existing institutions such as healthcare, capital markets, banking, the military, our education system, and other structures. Sanders and his far-left followers want revolutionary dismantling of these and other existing institutions. And so he was looking within the Democratic Party, and to some extent that is transcending now, let's say, because even though it's Trump in the White House, he's still sort of, you're looking and wondering, well, we see fissures within the Democratic Party, just as you do within the Republican Party, but he's not really going to be focusing too much on problems in the Republicans since he himself is a Democrat,
sure,
but seeing the conflict within the Democratic Party and wondering where it's going to go.
Right, and I think it's really important to this book that he does focus on this centrist part of the Democratic Party. I think that Republicans and other parties alike skew the Democrats to the far left. They're all far left. They're all Bernie Sanders, and Hillary Clinton's made out to be this criminal of sorts when there hasn't really been anything brought against her. And he really advocates that, you know, her policies are feasible in a lot of ways, and even if you're not preferenced to that, it is still something that's legitimate, more legitimate than other parties in some ways.
Quote I liked here, mainstream American voters want evolution, not revolution. They want stability, predictability, and gradual improvements. They don't want to see the United States model itself after Europe, where the political pendulum swings widely between left and right. Democracy thrives at the center and suffers when extremists are not marginalized. And so it's sort of his way again.
Sure.
And I think, you know, his book is sort of nice in the sense that it's not nutso. I try to avoid sort of some of the silly polemic books that exist and not use them on this show so that you get some sort of feeling like this, something here in normal land. Yeah. But, you know, and so Sanders, he's going on again. He's got quite a few pages about how he doesn't like Sanders and how Sanders was hurting the Clinton campaign. And so even though you have a Russia investigation, there are other factors that obviously are contributing to the defeat of Hillary Clinton, not just, say, Russia's involvement in exactly what ways it participated. Because one, he's sort of concerned about the fact that Sanders hurt Clinton in the election.
Right. A lot of people believed that at the time during the election, was that him being in the race in the first place was going to damage her campaign and that he was going to skew votes, and it did until he finally was eliminated from the race. But at that point, the whole email scandal was coming out, and at that point, it was a lost cause.
And so then he was going on, and again, boy, he's got pages on Sanders being anti-Israeli, and so, or feeling that he was, you know, maybe it's also sometimes his own perception of it, but,
sure.
And my guess is that if Sanders moved on, he might have moved to the center, but wondering where his supporters would be, you know.
Right.
And I think he's more concerned less about Sanders than what he perceives of as his supporters.
Sure.
And so when he's going on, it's interesting, he sort of felt it was important for the Republicans to maybe pick a centrist as opposed to Trump. And so he was saying he liked Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio, and which he saw as centrist. So. And so as a result, then, he was sort of thinking that what Clinton was going to do was bring some degree of stability. And I guess he's sort of now wondering where we are.
Sure. To his point about the supporters, I think that, yeah, it would have been bad if Sanders had gotten elected, for him to start moving towards the center of the left side of the aisle, because I think a lot of his supporters were very hardline left-wing supporters, and I think that would have caused kind of the same rift we see in the Republican Party right now with Donald Trump not being conservative enough, which is as conservative as he is. He's not conservative enough for a lot of the right-wing folks that had elected him into office. And so you're hearing outcry from that side of the aisle. You don't see it as much in the media, but you are hearing that outcry, that the person they voted for this change, this massive conservative change, isn't inducing that change as to the extreme or the degree that they want.
He said if Trump beats Clinton, so then that happens, Sanders will claim to become the head or leader of the Democratic Party, pointing to early polls showing that he would have beaten Trump. Were Clinton to lose, Sanders' influence within the Democratic Party would increase, and that his voters would believe that you need them to win a general election. And so it's interesting because I was thinking, I don't really see any discussion, and I'm not reading anything on Sanders, so that while he's saying this, it seems more like Sanders has somehow faded.
Sure.
And
well,
we're not really seeing that.
Well, you saw after the DNC emails came out, not the Hillary Clinton emails, but the DNC emails, where Debbie Wasserman Schultz had talked about smashing his campaign because of his age and his left-wing idealism, and talking about how they were literally, the Democratic Party, his own party, was fighting to take him down and push Hillary further. Kind of tend to agree with that, but I think afterwards, the Democrats going to him with their hat in their hand and asking for his support. I mean, of course he did. He did come out and say, I still support Hillary Clinton. But how does that look to the typical left-wing ideologue at home who just watched the candidate that they want get smashed by Hillary Clinton, by the Clinton machine, I guess?
I mean, his influence has kind of been hit or miss lately over the last couple of years since the election. I mean, he was one of the major voices for voting down that very first health care plan that Trump decided to propose to Congress, and in a way it did get passed through the House of Representatives, but once it reached the Senate, individuals such as Bernie Sanders, smashed it down. And he was also featured in that debate with Ted Cruz involving healthcare as well. So he's kind of been up and down a little bit lately.
Right, and I think that the big question that this book asks is, even though it's a critique of the 2016 election for the majority of it, it makes you turn and look to the next election. Where are Americans going to be falling there? Where do political parties need to be stationing themselves to be in a position to win next time? Are American people going to want the left and the right wings, or are they still looking for that middle ground that's seemed to kind of shift away? Well,
he was critical of Susan Sarandon, actress, saying that she was sort of in favor of having Trump get elected, not because she supported him, but because she supported Sanders as a way of being the catalyst to political revolution, sort of monumental change. And so again, he's saying this is silly. And I'm not sure if I'm seeing obviously severe criticism on the part of people that are saying they don't like the way Trump is acting or they feel uncomfortable with him, but I don't know whether I'm going to call it revolutionary change.
Well, think about it like this. If the Sanders camp didn't get in, and then you have someone as polarizing as Trump is, and come the 2020 elections, everybody looks at him as this hard right-wing ideologue. That's going to push everybody in the opposite. Those Bernie Sanders supporters who had voted for him in the first place, that's going to push them even harder to vote Democrat, because essentially they could say, look what you did. Look who you brought on. You couldn't get what you wanted, so you brought on this far right-wing ideologue, and we're in a worse position than we were in had we voted for Clinton. Had we sucked up our pride and voted for Clinton.
It tends to start the vicious cycle of just starting that pendulum that goes on back and forth in Europe. That's exactly how that gets started, because people put the idea, like you said, that Trump is a right-wing ideologue, and then the Bernie Sanders supporters are going to come in, and they're like, well, we need to counter extreme with a counterattack of extremism as well.
Sure.
It's almost a vote of spite.
Yeah, exactly. So I do kind of see where Susan Sarandon's coming from, where if we let Trump in the White House and he burns it down, that vilifies us.
He, again, was very critical of Comey as FBI director and said that he should have never used the words extremely careless when he issued his report on Clinton and her emails. He said that's not usually what you do, is you just sort of say, we're just not going ahead with prosecution, and you stop there. So it's interesting how he has criticism of the FBI director, which I say is quite different than the way you're looking at Trump and his supporters try to more broadly criticize the FBI. And so they're both criticized, but in different, more, I think that Dershowitz probably has a more coherent way of criticizing sort of the FBI director at that time, Comey, than sort of this more generic attack on the FBI that you're seeing from Trump and his supporters.
Sure. I do agree with kind of his point about Comey. I don't think it was Comey's place to come out and say that she was extremely careless, because I think at that point he's implying negligence, even criminal negligence at that point. But essentially saying, yeah, she was negligent, maybe even criminally so, but we're going to go ahead and not prosecute. Because, and again, they had rewritten the rules. There was no intent there, which I had worked for the State Department for 4 years and knew that if you sent emails that were classified on an unclassified server, whether you intended to or not, you were getting fired and getting a fine and maybe losing your clearance. Do I think that Hillary Clinton should have gone to jail for that? No.
Of all things to leave vague, that was the one.
Sure, yeah.
And the FBI is very good at leaving things vague for due purpose. I mean, that's what they're supposed to do. But it seems like they really overstepped their bounds there by releasing information that really wasn't there to release.
Sure.
I think where Comey really went wrong with all this was, if you remember correctly, he closed the investigation, and then just a few days before the election, he decided to open up the investigation once again. Honestly, he should have kept that closed until after the election had been over and the winner had, soundly been decided either way, be it Trump or Hillary.
Sure. But he was also between a rock and a hard place, because does he keep quiet and then it comes out after the election and then he looks like he was trying to back Trump's play by keeping his mouth shut, or does he release it and then he looks like he's backing Trump's play? Either way. So it's kind of a catch-22. I mean, he was kind of in a position where he couldn't keep it quiet, because if it got discovered later, then he looks like he was hiding something. And if he came out with it, we saw what happened.
Exactly. It was kind of a point where he really didn't have much of a good route to go, so it was really just pick your poison at that point.
Yeah. Right. He definitely, I think his timing wasn't necessarily flawed because it did need to come out. It was something that the American public did need to be aware of, especially considering the election was so close. But the way he worded it, again, it insinuated guilt when there wasn't guilt to be had yet.
Right.
We only have a few minutes left, so what do you think of the book, and do you recommend it to viewers?
Oh yeah, I definitely recommend it. I think that people who are vehemently opposed to Trump policies should definitely look at it. Not that it's pro-Trump, but it kind of sheds a more pragmatic light on Trump as a whole, and lets you know that not everything Trump does, for good or for ill, is a criminal act. And I think that that's his big point, is that justice is being weaponized, and any time that Trump does something that the left doesn't like, or that even Trump's opposers don't like, that it's somehow seen as this criminal act. He's breaking the law of some kind with his travel ban, etc. So yeah, I definitely think that he's coming from a centrist point of view, and I think that any book that anybody can get their hands on that kind of pulls things to the middle, yeah.
Right, I would definitely recommend it as well. It's a short read,
Yeah.
Super easy. The author's very well written. I do agree that it has a very centrist idea. It's not anti-Trump, it's not pro-Trump. He just lays out the information as it is. He keeps a very unbiased, basically unbiased action as he goes throughout the book, and I would definitely recommend it to other readers.
I would recommend it as well. I think what makes it really good is the fact that he doesn't necessarily stick on one point and just kind of just let it simmer and let it basically rot. He goes ahead and he moves on. And I think that's something that a political centrist needs to do, as opposed to, far right and far left. I tend to listen to the Rush Limbaugh show just to compare, centrist versus, far wingers, be it left or right. And I've noticed lately that Rush tends to just simmer on the whole Russian collusion and everything.
Sure.
Whereas here with this book, he sticks with certain issues for a little bit, and then he closes it and moves on.
Great.
That's exactly what we need.
All right, I think so too. It's a nice book, and I think you'll enjoy reading it. So thank you for joining us today.